We are continuing our series, The Good News According to Mark, as we are progressing our way through the Gospel of Mark. And if you are someone that's able to be here for the duration of this series, then collectively, by the end of this series, we will have read the entire book of Mark. We are preaching through it, verse by verse, story by story, and very much it's been a series that I've enjoyed, and I hope you have too, going through an entire book like this, and especially all books of the Bible are important, but especially the Gospels. And it's interesting to go through this narrative structure of Mark and be able to see Jesus go from town to town, place to place, the things that he said, the ways that he taught, the miracles that he did, and to understand them in the context of the storyline of how things are happening. I've really enjoyed being able to do that through the Gospel of Mark. Before we really get into our story, our passage this morning, I want to ask you the question: how would you act around Jesus? How would you act around Jesus? Now, I know there's a sense of we're always around Jesus, right? That's the real answer. If you're a Christian, if you're someone who believes in God, then you believe in the omnipresence of God, that he is present everywhere, that Jesus is present everywhere, and that every step you take, every breath you take, every interaction you have, God is there. And Jesus is there, and he's present in your life. And that is true. And yet, we understand that. But if Jesus was sitting next to me this morning, how different would my worship be? It'd be pretty different. If whatever you did on your Saturday, if Jesus was just alongside of you as you spent your Saturday, how different would your Saturday be? I think about how differently maybe I would parent my children if Jesus was standing over my shoulder every interaction I have with my children. How differently would I behave during a ball game if Jesus was sitting right there beside me as I'm watching a ball game? How different would the conversations be at the dinner table if Jesus was sitting at the dinner table with us? There's no doubt if Jesus was physically present with me all the time, that would affect how it is that I act. I can have the knowledge of, yes, I have full faith in who God is. I have full faith that he is everywhere. I have full faith that Jesus is present with me spiritually in every moment. I cannot deny that the physical presence of Jesus would change me. Now, the hope is, as I develop in my faith, as I continue in my walk with God, that I become more in tune with the fact that Jesus is present, and I become more obedient to the fact that Jesus is present. But how would you act if Jesus was present with you throughout your day? Most of us would be honest and say, I would act differently. And I would agree. And as we go through Mark, we see very human people, the apostles, who spend day by day by day, they spend that in the presence of Jesus. And as we go into Mark chapter 9, we encounter these people, these apostles and Jesus, who spend time together daily. We encounter this different sort of moment. You know, I think, how would you act around Jesus? And maybe this is where the disconnect is. How would we act around Jesus if he was with us physically, and how we act around Jesus even though we know he's with us spiritually? Maybe this is where the disconnect is. If we think about Jesus being with us physically, most of the time, if for instance, in this conversation, this theoretical, hypothetical thing I've thrown out, that's in like a one-day sense. How would I act if Jesus was with me for one day? You know, and I would be on my best behavior. And all of my conversations would be very holy. And I would be on my best behavior. But how would I act if Jesus was physically with me daily? Well, probably if I was with Jesus physically daily, I would slip more into the routine probably of how I live now. With Jesus is with me every day spiritually, but I lose sight maybe of who he is, or slip up in my own human nature. What if I was around him daily, every day? And that's what we encounter. Mark chapter 9, Jesus and his apostles. And it's this moment of profound irony and misunderstanding. that happens with Jesus and his apostles. Jesus is focused on his mission, that he's going to lay down his life. He reveals his coming death and his resurrection to his disciples. Yet instead of pondering this monumental revelation, they find themselves arguing about who among them is the greatest. In their proximity to Jesus, they miss the heart of the message, Jesus' message on selflessness, sacrifice, and service. And this story offers for us a mirror. As we go through this story, it does offer for us a mirror of how oftentimes we are in the presence of Jesus, and yet we are missing the message of Jesus. We are missing the message of selflessness and sacrifice and service. So let's go to Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37. This gives us some insight into what it's like in the daily life of the apostles and Jesus. And in Mark chapter 9, verses 30 through 37, we have 3 points, all beginning with the letter M. You're welcome. And the first thing I really want you to notice is Jesus' mission of sacrifice. Jesus is really on mission here. If you remember back in Mark chapter 8, like I said, we've been working our way through Mark. If you remember back previous one chapter in Mark chapter 8, Peter has the confession of who Jesus Christ is, and he says that Jesus is the Son of the living God. He is the Messiah. Jesus affirms Peter in that proclamation, and then right after that confession, Jesus plainly tells his apostles that he is going to Jerusalem, that he is going to be killed by religious leaders, and that he is going to be resurrected from the dead. Right after he tells them that, they're confused. Peter rebukes him. But the main thing I want you to remember is Jesus had already told him this. Now we come to Mark chapter 9. Here in the first part of this passage we're going to read, Jesus is telling them again. He's going to tell them plainly again. So Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 30. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. And he did not want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples, saying to them, the Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days he will rise. They did not understand the saying, and they were afraid to ask him. Now, a couple things here as we remember what we've gone through in the story of Mark. You had Peter's confession. You had Jesus talking about how he was going to die and be raised again. You have Peter's rebuke. Peter goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, that's not going to happen. And Jesus famously says, get behind me, Satan. This is going to happen. Jesus has the moment of transfiguration on the Mount of Transfiguration, where he takes Peter, James, and John with him up on the mountain. And while he's up on the mountain, his full glory is revealed in that moment, and Moses and Elijah are there ministering to Jesus. And it's this turning point in Jesus' ministry where when he comes down from the mountain, and what this passage is hinting at, when he comes down from the mountain, Jesus is starting his journey toward Jerusalem. He is coming down from the mountain more on mission, directly attacking the mission that he has to die for the sins of the world, to go to Jerusalem to his death. So that's where this passage picks up. They went on from there and passed through Galilee. He's heading south. This is interesting. And he didn't want anyone to know. Jesus is saying we're going to travel in secret. And what's the purpose of that? Jesus didn't want anybody to know because this was a special time that he was going to teach his apostles. He didn't want anyone to know, for he was teaching his disciples. This was an important teaching. He was teaching his disciples. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Tells them plainly again what's going to happen. Verse 32, but they did not understand the saying and were afraid to ask him. Why do you think they were afraid to ask Jesus about this saying? Any ideas maybe why they were afraid to ask Jesus about this saying? Maybe they were nudging Peter and saying, hey, Peter, why don't you go talk to Jesus about this saying? And Peter's probably thinking, last time I did that, I was called Satan. I am not going to be the one who goes before Jesus and starts questioning him about these things, because last time I did so, I was thrown under the bus. Maybe that's why they were afraid to ask Jesus. Maybe it was that they were afraid to receive more information. You know, sometimes maybe you get a little bit of bad information, not information that's not true, but bad information in that it's not good to hear. It's thing that makes you sad or grieves you to some degree, and you get that information, and sometimes our reaction is, I don't want to hear any more of that. I don't want any more detail. I don't need to hear any more about this bad thing. Maybe that's what the apostles were dealing with, is the loss of their friend and their Messiah. And it's like they're taking a step back and say, we don't want to hear anything more about this. I don't think that's necessarily it. I think it's more so they didn't understand, but they saw maybe how devoted, how untasked Jesus was, and they were thinking, we don't want to distract him. We don't want to be called Satan. We just want to follow and see what happens. So Jesus has this clear teaching of his mission. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men, and they will kill him. And when he is killed, after 3 days, he will rise. Jesus tells them this right now. And in the next chapter, as they are still journeying, Jesus tells them this same thing again. Multiple times, Jesus is telling them, hey, this is going to happen. I'm going to be killed. I'm going to be in the grave. I'm going to rise. So we have this clear mission of sacrifice that Jesus is giving here in Mark chapter 9. Second thing I want you to notice as we go through this story of Jesus and the apostles daily living together is the apostles' misguided ambition. And this is what Tony read for us, where the conversation is revealed that they had been having a conversation about who's the greatest. So they had some misguided ambition. Mark chapter 9, starting in verse 33. And they came to Capernaum. And when he was in the house, he asked them, what were you discussing on the way? But they kept silent, for on the way they had argued with one another about who was the greatest. Sometimes Jesus just throws questions out there, and in the best way possible, sometimes Jesus is a bit of a pot stirrer, and Jesus knows, I've got to stir something out of these apostles here. I've got to ask some probing questions to them that's going to confront them to some degree and bring them to the place that I need them to be. And you can see from the apostles' reaction, this is not a conversation that they wanted to have. Jesus says, hey, by the way, now that we're, all together in this room, what was it y'all were discussing on the way? And they kept silent. Why did they keep silent? Because of shame. Because of shame. The argument that they had been having about who is the greatest, and could you imagine that argument going, and probably the way that they travel, Jesus is the leader, and they're following behind Jesus. So Jesus is out in front, and they're probably not single file, but they're in groups staggered behind Jesus. And as they're in groups behind Jesus, probably an organic conversation comes about maybe who stands close to Jesus right now as we're walking down the road. And then it's like, well, I think the person who stands closest to Jesus should be the one that's Jesus' best friend. I think the one that stands closest to Jesus as we go down this road, I think that should be the person maybe that Jesus has let see some things that you other guys haven't been able to see. There may be conversations like that. It's like, well, actually, Jesus said this about me, and Peter, Jesus told you to get behind him. So, there was this jockeying for position. And I'm not talking, of course, literally behind Jesus and following, but they were arguing about which one of them is the greatest. Which one of them should be in the places of honor when Jesus comes into his kingdom. These are the kinds of things that they were arguing. Who is the greatest? And in those moments, and we've all been there too. You have been in not arguing about who's the greatest, but there have been many times in your life, so many times in my life, where I am having a conversation that by nature of it, is very petty and is meaningless in the grand scheme of things. But I don't see it in that moment. In that moment, what do I want to do? I want to win an argument. I want my opinion to be heard. I want to win, maybe even at all costs, no matter feelings that are hurt. In that moment, that's the thing that I want. But it's funny how these things change when you are within view or within earshot of the Savior. And when Jesus asked them about this conversation that maybe just moments ago made perfect sense to them, when Jesus asked them about it, they were like, oh yeah, probably shouldn't have been talking about that, Jesus. You're right. We've all been there. And wouldn't it be great for us to live this way with a constant view of, hey, Jesus is within earshot, Jesus can see what I'm doing, and take that knowledge of who he is and how good he is, and let that goodness of him guide me into living in an appropriate way? That would be a great way to live. But we, like the apostles, become used to our daily walk with Jesus. And sometimes us becoming used to that daily walk with Jesus distracts us from being on mission like we should be. And different times we become misguided in our ambitions. We become misguided in our ambitions in our employment. We become misguided in our ambitions when it comes to our relationships. Into living in this world, we often become misguided. And sometimes it takes a probing question from Jesus. It takes a little bit of confrontation from Jesus for us to be reminded, oh yeah, I should have a totally different set of ambitions. I need that from Jesus to confront me. And to use this other word that is a little more challenging, to convict me, to make me feel shameful. There are times where we really should feel shame. And we should let that shame guide us in repentance, guide us towards turning our life more to being Christ-centered. So we see a misguided ambition here from the apostles, something that we all fall guilty to as well. And in Jesus' instruction on their ambition, we see Jesus' message of humble service. His message of humble service. That's what we see in the rest of the passage here, which is what really the core of our teaching here is at the end of our lesson. In Mark chapter 9, verses 35 through 37, Jesus sees the kind of conversations that they're having about who's the greatest, and he instructs them in this way. Verse 35, and he sat down and called the 12. And he said to them, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Now this is important. He sat down and called the 12. You know, if you're at work and you see your boss, and your boss is very chummy, and you're talking in the hallways, you know in that moment that it's a good relationship, you're not in any danger at all, but the moment your boss says, hey, will you come have a seat with me real quick? It's a little different. You don't feel as chummy in that moment. In that moment, you probably feel like we're about to have a serious conversation if this is going to involve us sitting down together in this moment. And I think you see some of that here with Jesus. Is Jesus taking the time to show some importance about the conversation that they're going to have. And then you look at the tradition of the rabbis of the time, and the tradition is that the teacher sits and the students stand around the teacher. So Jesus is signifying this is important. We're about to have a real teaching. I'm going to sit down. You are going to gather around as I teach you something important. And his important teaching is, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. So you got to remember, this is within the context of their inappropriate ambitions, their ambitions of becoming great. And Jesus says, let me tell you about greatness. If anyone would be great, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Commentator William Barclay, he says this: for the ambition to rule, he substituted the ambition to serve. For the ambition to have things done for us, he substitutes the ambition to do things for others. If anyone would be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. Jesus gives this very important teaching about what it means to have success in his kingdom, about what it means to be great in his kingdom. And it's all about other people. It's all about having an appropriate view of self and an appropriate view of other people. He goes on, he puts legs on this teaching, as all good teachers do. He uses illustrations and metaphor, and he puts legs on this teaching, starting in verse 36. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. This is in Matthew chapter 18, Jesus does something similar, but it's a different teaching. In Matthew chapter 18, Jesus takes a child, puts the child in the midst of him and the apostles, and says, unless you become like one of these, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. That's a different teaching than what we're seeing here in Mark. In Matthew, Jesus looks at the child and says, unless you become like one of these. Jesus is saying, unless you become childlike. That's not what Jesus is teaching here in Mark. Here in Mark chapter 9, he says, whoever receives one such child in my name. So it's not about necessarily becoming like a child here in Mark. It's about how do you receive a child. And to really understand this teaching, we need to understand sort of how children are viewed in this time period. And I think Jesus is speaking about little children, and he's speaking about maybe little children that are not your descendants, but children maybe that are within your community. How do you treat the children that are within your community? And most children, they were not had much value placed upon them. They were viewed as much as property as they were as individuals. They were mostly viewed as a means to an end. And this just to guide us here in this conversation, because again, Jesus is speaking about how is it that you receive children, okay? Small children are worthless. Seems harsh. I'm not just saying that because I currently have small children and I have a toddler right now, and I feel like I'm bullied by a toddler a lot, and I'm taking this out on him right now. But small children are worthless in that there's no monetary value to small children. There is only expenses when it comes to children. They are not making you any money. They are not bringing anything to your life where they are adding resources to your life. Do they bring joy? Yes, of course. Our sweet little ones bring so much joy to our lives. But in the cold, calculating mind that was ruling at this day, they bring no monetary value. They are worthless. And you see this reflected in Scripture where children are trying to be ushered to Jesus, and Jesus' own followers are shooing the children away. And Jesus says, no, bring them to me. Children, small children, viewed as worthless. Small children viewed as useless. You have to do everything for small children. Anything that happens for them, you have to do. And it's extremely tiring. It's a lot of hard work, because if you're someone who you are truly looking after a small child, it is constant work. It's constant work. And it's within this framework, that Jesus is saying, how do you receive children? Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. In many ways, this is sort of tricky to talk about. In one sense, God could look at us and say things that are very similar to us about what we have pointed out about small children here. Worthless. Do we bring any, in one sense, what do we bring to God in value-wise that God doesn't already have? What service do we bring to God that God cannot do for himself? When it comes to God bringing us into a relationship with him, what kind of work has he had to put in to bring us into a relationship with him? A lot of hard work. In another sense, we have tremendous value because God has placed tremendous value on us as his children. So it can kind of be difficult to talk about. But we should be able to look at this also and see our fellow man. I think this is the direction Jesus is going here. The apostles were debating on who is the greatest in their own selfish ambitions. And the apostles were debating on serving self, ultimately, and how to elevate self. And in no way did they think, I know how I elevate self. It's by focusing on other people. And that's the direction Jesus is going here. Elevating self, it's actually about focusing on other people. That's what he meant when he said, if anyone will be first, he must be last, must be servant of all. He says, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. He's getting to ambitions and greatness. And just put it clearly here. Greatness in the world is pursuit of advancing self. Greatness in the world is pursuit of advancing self. That's how anybody would basically define greatness or success is by you doing things to be in pursuit of you achieving certain things or certain goals. It's about pursuing the advancement of self. And this is taxing, very taxing to be in pursuit of advancing self. Be in pursuit of serving self. And I'm not just talking about it's taxing in the amount of time it takes to devote to yourself, to pursue self, in the effort it takes to advance self in whatever capacity, work, socially, relationships. Of course, it's going to take a tremendous amount of time. It's going to take a tremendous amount of effort. There's going to be a tremendous amount of mental toll because you're constantly thinking about, man, what makes me happy? What gets me to where the place that I need to go to? And then you know this as well. So many times in our life, we think we know that answer, and we get the thing that we've been working hard for only to realize that we are asking ourselves the same question once we get there. Well, what makes me happy? What is it I have to pursue next to be happy? What is it I have to pursue next in order to be pleased with the life that I have? And whatever it is that you're pursuing, if by chance you somehow grasp it, you understand. Well, now that I have it, I just got to pursue something even more. It never stops. And this is not earth-shattering or anything. But we know from Jesus' teachings, you know from your relationship with the church and living out Christian principles, that greatness in the kingdom is pursuit of advancing others. There's difficulty here too. The pursuit of advancing others. There's time when it comes to advancing others. There's effort when it comes to advancing others. Yes, it's mentally taxing to advance others. There's also social situations sometimes with our pursuit to advance others where we might be harmed socially because of our decision to advance other people and their causes and to put them first. Sometimes we might be punished in a sense socially for this as well. But it is a purer pursuit. And while there are still difficulties around this pursuit, they're not nearly as taxing. If you're in pursuit of self, you are constantly in pursuit of serving the same self and serving an appetite that is never filled. You're in pursuit of advancing others. Their appetite is fulfilled the moment that you advance them. In a singular act, mostly because we live in a world that is so self-centered that people are not used to having other people serve them. In a singular act of us serving other people, be it a random stranger on the street or be it someone we are in deep relationship with, there is an incredible amount of fulfillment on the other person, for the other person, when we sacrifice our own ambition in order to serve them. There is in that moment a fulfillment that while maybe we don't experience, it is something greater than they can even offer themselves. I'm trying to think of a good way to illustrate that. You're capable of fixing a meal for yourself. You are totally capable of fixing a meal for yourself. You might be a Sandra Shaney Felton. You might be one of the greatest cooks in the world. And you might be able to create a absolutely delicious meal for yourself. But how much sweeter is it when someone takes time to deliver a meal to you? And it might not taste as good. But man, is it filling. They have fulfilled a need that you didn't even recognize that you had. They have brought something to you that you didn't even know how much you would appreciate someone else doing that for you for a change. There is a fulfillment there that you cannot provide for yourself. But in our decision to advance the need of others, we are fulfilling a need that they can't fulfill for themselves. And man, isn't that great about being part of a congregation and being part of a church and knowing that, yes, I am committed to being in pursuit of advancing others, but I'm part of a body of believers who collectively, we are all in that pursuit. And us all being in that pursuit means sometimes that pursuit's going to fall my way. Sometimes there's going to be other people pursuing my advancement while I am pursuing other people's advancement. Greatness in the kingdom of heaven. If anyone would be first, he must be last, must be a servant of all. Lastly, just as we think about this teaching, if anyone would be first, he must be last of all and a servant of all. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. There is this receiving of Jesus. When we choose to advance the need of others, Jesus is saying, you are choosing to advance the needs of the kingdom. You are choosing to advance the needs of Jesus himself. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And then there's a benefit. Whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. And Jesus is talking about in this eternal sense. So to wrap this up, we started with this question. How would you act around Jesus? And I think we have a pretty good way of knowing, if Jesus was in my presence, I know how I would act. And yes, I'm now identifying, I knew this before, that's how I should act all the time, right? I should act all the time like Jesus is riding in the car with me. I should act all the time like Jesus is at the dinner table with me. I should act all the time like Jesus is the one that's holding the television remote. Like that's how I should act. That he's with me constantly, because the reality is that he is with me constantly. How would I act around Jesus? The encouraging thing is not how would you act around Jesus, but how does Jesus act around you? This is the encouraging side of our relationship with Jesus. It's how does Jesus act around me? And sometimes it might be a probing question of, hey, what were you talking about? Justin, what were you watching just now? How were you talking to your spouse just now? Sometimes Jesus' actions on my life might look something like that. It might be a bit convicting. It might bring about a certain sort of shame or grief or guilt in my life that ultimately, through his good purposes, forces me to realign with his will. How does Jesus act around you? That's how Jesus acts around us. But there's a lot more ways that Jesus acts around us. Of ways that how Jesus acts around us. And he's the ultimate encourager. He's the ultimate peace giver. Jesus often acts around us when we're going through something, and before we know it, a brother or sister in Christ is there with us with an arm around our shoulder or our neck, saying, I'm going through this with you, brother. I'm going through this with you, sister. That's Jesus acting. That's the presence of Jesus acting on us in this world. When we read God's word and we read these powerful words that are written on these pages, and we read it and we say, man, this is speaking to my soul. That's Jesus acting on us, encouraging us, drawing us to something greater, comforting us, establishing us, protecting us. These are all ways that Jesus still acts on us today, works on us today. But it does require obedience. It does require us recognizing who Jesus is. And I submit to that. I give my life to that. And that's the invitation we offer all of us this morning. The invitation to put your full faith, your full trust in Jesus Christ. In that He is who He says He is, that He's the Messiah. But also you put your full faith and trust in that He is who He says He is, that He is someone who does convict at times, get behind me, Satan, but who does offer comfort and peace. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. He is both. The convictor, the shepherd, the comforter. He is all of these things. And when we put our faith and trust, we say, my faith and my trust is in Him able to fulfill these roles. So invitation is open for you this morning. We're going to sing a song. If during that song you think, I need to commit my life to Christ, I need to do so in a public way, that opportunity is here for you. If you look at your life and you say, I've committed to Him, but I am failing so much that I need the prayers of the church. I need to ask for forgiveness. I'm going through some things, and I need to talk to the church about this. That opportunity is here for you this morning as well. If there's anything that the church can do for you in your walk with God, why don't you come as we stand and as we sing.